chair of our committee. Also on the committee, John Fong from biology, and Crystal Hoyt from the Jepson School. The way this is going to work, Katie will present for, let's say, 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, about that.
Okay. And then the committee will ask the questions, and after we're finished, we'll open it up for you all to ask questions as well. Okay? So, Katie?
Thanks. First of all, thank you all for coming. And I guess to start off, I should probably mention that I am a leadership studies major, but I am also pre-med and will be applying to medical school this summer. So for this project, I kind of wanted to incorporate both of those interests into maybe something that was more beneficial for like the long term and maybe my future career. So in considering that, I wanted to kind of look at physicians as leaders, not only for their patients, but also sort of for society in general. And in doing that, I wanted to see if physicians had any types of obligations or responsibilities that they had to fulfill. And in doing that, I looked into whether physicians have a moral obligation to practice the healthy behaviors that they advise their patients to do and sort of practice what they preach. So, oh, and I should probably also mention that when I'm talking about the health of a physician, I'm actually referring to sort of their healthy behaviors and their preventative measures that they take, and not actually their physical health, where that's more your triglyceride levels and cholesterol levels and things like that, where this is actually their healthy behaviors and the way that their patients perceive them as being healthy. So here we go. Physicians are considered leaders in the healthcare field, and they have an expert knowledge of the body and health. And when they don't practice their healthy behaviors, this may affect the patient's perceptions of the physicians and the physician's ability to influence their patients. This summer, Dr. Regina Benjamin was nominated to be the Surgeon General, and this nomination actually brought on a lot of criticism because, as you can see, she's not terribly overweight, but her weight issues did cause some concerns, and people were questioning her ability to be a good role model for Americans when obesity is such a huge problem. And so this brought me to the question, do physicians have moral obligations to practice healthy behaviors? So I took this approach through several different ethical frameworks, the first being consequentialism. And consequentialism evaluates an action based solely on the outcome or consequences of that action. Therefore, morally right action would be one that produces good consequences. And utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism, and it aims to achieve total utility throughout society by increasing the total pleasure and happiness among the people. Therefore, an act is considered morally right if it maximizes total utility. John Stuart Mill is one of the main philosophers for this ethical framework, and he makes the distinction that there are differences in the quality of the pleasures, and that there are higher and lower pleasures. These higher pleasures, he thinks, includes your higher faculties, like your intellect and your mind, where the lower pleasures are more related to your body. And it's interesting to note that when he makes an argument for choosing higher an argument for higher pleasures, why sometimes people will choose to go through a lower pleasure at the expense of a higher pleasure, he makes a statement that they pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. So in this statement, he makes a distinct preference for health as a higher pleasure because of its intrinsic superiority over unhealthy behaviors. But this is kind of confusing because it goes against what he was saying about higher pleasures being of the mind and the intellect. So you would think that health is more related to the body and would be more of a lower pleasure. And so I looked at the circumstantial advantages because he also talks about that that's a way that higher pleasures can be considered better than lower pleasures, and talking about the greater permanency, safety, and uncostliness of health over unhealthy behaviors. And then he also, then I found, since health has higher circumstantial advantages than the lower pleasures, that health lies somewhere in between the higher and the mental pleasures, both for circumstantial and intrinsic natures. So therefore, total utility would be greater maximized by striving to maintain health than by giving into the temptations of sensual pleasures. So then we need to look at how total utility can be maximized if we are to increase healthy behaviors over unhealthy ones. And Mill also points to public benefactors as people who have the rare ability to affect total utility in society. And he calls on these people to consider public utility, whereas other people should only be considering utility in smaller circumstances. And he gives these people the responsibility to perform these acts that even if they would result in good consequences for themselves, if they were to be negative, if they were to be applied throughout the rest of society, if it were to result in negative consequences, that they should abstain from those behaviors. So I will argue that physicians can be seen as public benefactors since they do see hundreds of patients every week and therefore have the responsibility to abstain from these lower pleasures and unhealthy behaviors so not to decrease total utility. So in order to do that, you have to show that physicians can influence patients. And I found this through numerous studies that patients listen to their physician and make the appropriate behavioral changes, and that physician counseling and screening practices are influenced by their own personal prevention habits. And physicians trying to improve their behavior were somewhat more likely to discuss these related habits with their patients, and that counseling can be even more effective when physicians disclose their own health habits. So therefore, these studies show that physicians who actually do practice healthier health habits are more likely to counsel their patients and be an influence to them, and so their patients are more likely to adopt these healthy practices as well. And then I also tried to consider since we're only looking at the consequences of the action, if a physician could lie about their behaviors. There was one study that showed that having a helmet or an apple on their desk increased their confidence in the physician. And so if a physician could simply just do that, and the same outcome might be able to be produced if that was permissible. But Mill believes that lying is generally morally wrong and contributes to a lying disposition and also weakens trust in society. So therefore, physicians should not be able to lie about their health practices if this is not justified to bring about the near consequences of the patient's health. So then I also looked into the obligations of physicians. And obligations can be considered to bind someone to a specific action, and they can come from a variety of reasons and circumstances like laws, contracts, or promises. But these obligations are also created by social norms that are within a group. And the medical community can be considered one of these groups and has their own standards of behavior for physicians. So I tried to look at different medical societies to see if they had their own stated standards for the way a physician should treat their health. And I couldn't really find any, and the AMA, the American Medical Association, they have an opinion that comes the closest to offering a suggestion that physicians should be healthy, but it's more intended for physicians to be so healthy so as it doesn't impair their actual duties and the safety of the patient. So that wasn't very helpful. And then I also looked at the Hippocratic Oath, which is an ancient Greek text, which it discusses various things like abortion and consent and truth-telling and things like that, but it also doesn't really talk about physician health. So then I kind of turned to John Gregory. He was an English physician in the late 1700s, and he wrote on the lectures and duties of qualifications of a physician. And he writes on the character of a physician and sort of creates the standards for the medical community and their behaviors. And he also doesn't really address the physician's own health, but he does talk about the appearance of physicians and their actual dress. And so I thought that this could correlate into how physicians were perceived and could also be included with their ideas of health. So he states that if the customs or prejudices of any country affix the idea of sense, knowledge, or dignity to any manner of dress, it is unquestionably a physician's business from the common principles of self-preservation to equip himself accordingly. And so, again, he's talking about dress, but I'm going to try to apply this to physical health as well. And so society creates these norms and standards for how physicians and things like that should dress. And I looked into studies and found that the typical white coat and formal attires actually are cultural norms for how physicians qualified physicians are perceived. And so it was actually very interesting. 64% of the people studied thought that the way their doctor dressed, while not the most important, was very important, and that more patients were willing to share their problems with physicians who were professionally dressed. And that I also looked into studies where it wasn't just the white coat and their physical appearance, but also there were studies on obese versus non-obese physicians, and those that patients who saw non-obese physicians reported greater credibility and confidence in those physicians than patients who saw non-obese physicians. And this literature kind of goes to support the implicit leadership theories that we talk about, where a physician prototype is set by the standards of the culture, and patients or other members of study unconsciously compare their physician that they're seeing with this prototype, and their ability to distinguish this physician as a leader is correlated with how well that physician matches this prototype. And so we can see that the society actually does create norms and standards for how physicians should look. But I wanted to figure out if physicians have a moral obligation, and so societies randomly create these symbols that can distinguish leaders, and a white coat is just an arbitrary symbol. It doesn't necessarily mean a physician is more qualified or smarter or better able to diagnose a patient. And so Ruth Benedict points that norms are random and may depend on the influences that create these factors. So then, before I completely disregarded that, I looked into the theory of cultural relativism, which states that you can't base or evaluate practices in different cultures because there's no standard way to judge these practices. But Rachel's also mentions how that while practices may be different throughout society, they may actually represent a respect for a universal idea. And so I came to the conclusion that wearing a white coat and being non-obese and practicing these standards of appearance are actually ways that physicians show respect and to their profession and to the patient-physician relationship. And so therefore this does create a moral obligation for physicians to follow these societal standards. And then I also looked into Kant and his perception of duties. He talks a lot about duties and reason, and he doesn't explicitly mention the obligation to be healthy, but we can sort of use his ethical framework to evaluate this. And he says, uses the catechol imperative to base actions on whether they are moral, and says that I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become universal law. So it's sort of like the golden rule, where you should only act in ways in which it would be okay if everyone else acted that way. And then there are also ways to decide if an action is morally wrong, and one of them is a contradiction conception, where this goes against the categorical imperative because you can't even imagine that world to exist, where you can will something to happen, but you can't imagine it being generalized. And he mentions committing suicide or breaking promises as these types of things. And this results in a strict duty not to perform these actions. And so this shows that if physicians do make a promise or a contract to be healthy, that they would have a strict duty not to practice these healthy behaviors. And then I looked at the Cleveland Clinic, how they are having a new hiring policy where they, the new employees are promising that they don't smoke, and they're going through a screening process, which is checking for the nicotine levels. And so this is kind of reaffirming their promise and everything. And so that these physicians and employees do have a promise to be healthy and not to smoke. But this kind of, it's only a hiring process. It's not actually for current employees, and this isn't in other hospitals, so I didn't think that this could be generally applied. So I also looked at the contradictions in will that Kant talks about. And in these, you may be able to imagine a world where what you will is allowed, but you wouldn't want such a world to exist. And he mentions developing our capacity and, capacities and helping others, and that this results in a broad duty to perform these acts most of the time. So you can look at if a physician wants to practice an unhealthy behavior, they may will that action, and they may be able to see a world in which everyone did practice those unhealthy behaviors. But because a physician's main responsibility is the health of their patients, they have to will also that their patients practice these healthy behaviors. So while they can imagine a world in which everyone practices unhealthy behaviors, they wouldn't want that world to exist. Because they also have to will that their patients practice healthy behaviors. So this results in a broad duty for physicians to practice healthy behaviors. Yes, and then Kant also talks about how people are averse to any close examination of their actions and shy away from it, endeavoring on the contrary to discover subjective grounds on which to find everything right or wrong. So Kant's talking about how people don't actually try to apply the categorical imperative, and will find ways, like a physician practicing their unhealthy behaviors may find it acceptable, but when they actually do evaluate themselves and judge the categorical imperative, that they find that they do have to practice healthy behaviors. So for the third ethical framework, I looked at virtue ethics, and this is based around Plato and mostly Aristotle's writings. And Plato, I found, defines health and healthy behaviors to be a type of good, but he also goes on to say that physicians should be relatively unhealthy in order to gain knowledge and experience of particular diseases that their patients may have. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and questioned why he could think this if he thought that health was a good. But Plato actually separates the physical world, the one that we live in, with the world of the truth and the forms and things like that. And so he can actually separate the physical body from the higher truth and knowledge. And so that was a way that he could justify physicians being unhealthy, because they're not actually using their bodies to help heal them. And then I looked at Aristotle, who talks about eudaimonia, which he refers to as happiness, and this being the highest good. And in order for someone to have eudaimonia, they need to not only practice their acts virtuously, but they must also have external goods, and one of these external goods includes health. And then he also talks about how we learn our virtues through habituation, and so in order for people to learn how to be healthy, they need to learn how to do this through habituation, and this can be done through their parents, but this can be problematic because if parents aren't practicing healthy behaviors at home, their children are learning these unhealthy behaviors as well. So we may actually need physicians to be good role models for their patients. And so when we talk about the right type of habituation, and we can consider health to be the mean, and practicing it between the excess of overly healthy versus unhealthy behaviors. And Aristotle notes that both excessive and deficient exercises ruin strength, and likewise too much or too little eating or drinking ruins health, while the proportionate amount produces, increases, and preserves it. So thus, health can be considered a mean between obsessively dieting or worrying about your health and practicing too many unhealthy behaviors like smoking or not exercising and things like that. And so physicians should actually try to practice health towards this mean. But I also looked and found that situations can actually affect one's likelihood of practicing their virtues. I looked at the Milgram studies, which shows that participants were able to shock other people and kind of go away from their virtues and morals when they were told to do so by an authority figure. And I also looked at the Darling and Batson's From Jerusalem to Jericho study, and this showed that ministers who were primed to, that they were in a hurry, that they had to go somewhere very quickly, were less able to help a person that needed help on the street than those who were not in a hurry. So this kind of shows that time pressures and situational effects actually do have a large effect on whether people practice their virtues. And so this may explain why physicians, even though they know what these healthy behaviors are, don't practice them, that physician situations actually may not be supportive of their healthy behaviors because they have long work days, high caseloads, time pressures, poor sleep habits, and high performance expectations. And that this may actually be unsupportive of practicing healthy habits. So the medical community has recently started to look into this, and they limited the residency work hours to 80 hours a week. But this still, as you can see, 80 hours is still a lot, and there's still maybe an unhealthy environment for physicians. So I made several suggestions for improving the situations where hospitals should offer healthy and affordable food options at the hospital. A lot of times physicians are under too much stress and time and have to eat what the hospital provides or eat what they have. And actually more commonly now, fast food and specifically McDonald's are starting to be in hospitals, and that this doesn't really promote healthy behaviors. And then also that the medical community can encourage physicians going to the gym and wellness classes. A lot of hospitals have these types of gyms and programs, but they're not utilized maybe as regularly as they should be. So in conclusion, I looked at the 3 ethical frameworks and found physicians to have a moral obligation to practice healthy behaviors from each of them. In the consequentialism view, health is a higher pleasure than unhealthy behaviors, and physicians are considered public benefactors. So therefore, in order to help increase public utility, they also need to practice healthy behaviors. And I also looked at deontological ethics and found that obligations can come from society, and these are moral obligations because the physician's code or healthy behaviors actually represents a respect, a mutual respect for the profession. And through virtue ethics, that health is the mean between these 2 extremes, and that the medical community should work to improve the physician's environment so that they are better able to practice these healthy behaviors. And that's it. Questions?
Want to stand?
Doesn't matter, I can stand.
What do you want?
Where would I sit? Chair? Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
Well, I guess I'll start. First of all, I'd like to commend you for a very good presentation and a very good thesis.
Thank you.
So let me start with some questions, because I always have questions on everything. So I guess I'll start with where you ended, about the situation impacts our behaviors, and we know that. So are you arguing, it seemed like maybe you were, here on page 57, are you arguing that we may not be held to account for our behaviors if the situation is bad?
I guess sort of, that the physician should still be able to practice these virtues in health and be able to be a role model and things, but that a lot of the times that their environment and what they're placed in can prevent them or make it much more difficult for them to practice these healthy behaviors. And so while they should, I guess they shouldn't be held as accountable because there's other factors that are involved. And so that's why I suggested the hospitals and other community to try and I guess help physicians be able to practice these healthy behaviors so that they actually can practice these virtues.
So would you generalize that argument? So for example, Abu Ghraib, that was a situation, so a lot of social psychologists talk about the power situation in Abu Ghraib, situation where there was a prison and the prisoners were treated, some people would say, very immorally. So with the, would you suggest that the men and women who were acting unethically to the prisoners there are, in some sense, should not be held accountable for that behavior morally because of the situation?
I think you should go so far as to say that they shouldn't be held accountable at all. I think that there's definitely some sort of thing, like you could also apply like the other ethical frameworks and things like that so that you would be held morally accountable. But that the situation does have a huge factor. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're not totally without obligation or responsibility to their actions, but I guess that it gets hazier when you bring in extreme situations such as this. And so when you're placed in more everyday situations, type of thing, that's when you should actually be practicing these healthy behaviors. Does that make sense?
It's a tricky question. It's something I care a lot about. Social psychologists care about the situation.
Yeah.
So I was asking a very tricky question. Let me ask one more, and then I'll pass it over. And I guess I'll go to the beginning of the paper now, to go to Mill and the argument with Mill. So I have a question for you. Might it be the case, so Mill's argument about health, might it be the case that health impedes the higher, bad health impedes your ability to attain these higher goods or the higher facilities, intellect? So I don't know, but to me it seems like potentially an argument to make, which is a little different than the argument you're making, but the reason it is, the reason why in this case, health is seen as a virtue, or probably using the wrong words here, is because it actually, without health, you can't reach these higher facilities, you can't think properly, and the intellect, feelings, and imaginations, and the moral sentiments, which is kind of related to, I think, what Aristotle what you were talking about with Aristotle at the end of health, being kind of external, but you need it as a road. Is that a possible interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. Because when I saw it, I was looking at that he considers health to be a higher good, and so I was confused on why he was saying this was something that's not mental, but it's more physical, and like where this was going to fall. And so I was more concerned with it being higher pleasure than a higher quality of pleasure than, I guess, unhealthy behaviors when you're looking at total utility and stuff. But I think that that's definitely an interpretation that you can consider.
Katie, I'd also like to commend you on a very nice job with the thesis and fine presentation. The first question I have for you relates to your research on the Hippocratic Oath. And I was wondering if, based on what you researched, if you found that there's a reason to believe that physicians are violating the Hippocratic Oath by not maintaining healthy lifestyles. Could you speak to that? It was actually a lot less helpful than I was anticipating. I thought that it talked about how the relationship between the physician and their mentor and kind of the public and the private spheres. And so it talks about the relationships with patients and that they should be able to keep secrets and things like abortion and things like that. But it didn't really address anything about the physical health of the physician, at least that I could understand at least. So I didn't want it to be that helpful. And one of the studies you looked at showed that physicians who have the healthy lifestyle, I suppose, who appear physically fit, are more effective in terms of counseling patients and having patients give confidence to what they're saying. There's a difference between confidence and compliance, though, and I'm wondering if you saw any studies that showed that patients actually were more likely to follow the instructions of the physician who's...
It wasn't so much following physicians who disclosed. It showed that they were, I think, better able to motivate their patients to practice these healthy habits, but I didn't really look into anything on the actual, because that's what's key, is if the patients can maintain these healthy habits and things like that overall. And the only real thing, one study I mentioned was that physicians who were more likely to counsel their patients on the benefits of exercise and things like that actually were more likely to practice these things as well, but nothing really on physicians who disclose their own health habits and the effects on that. And was that what you were saying?
Right. And the ones who, I think you were referring to a different study too that was also in that same section of the paper, showing that the physicians who have healthy lifestyles tend to discuss more with patients who to maintain those lifestyles.
And so I was wondering if the effect was more because of the physicians are actually more likely to talk with patients about that as opposed to the fact that the patient sees them as a healthy person.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it was, I think they even addressed this, I didn't really mention it in my paper, but they attributed one of the reasons why this might be happening is because if physicians are practicing the healthy behaviors, they know, or they feel that these are important practices to have, and that they'll also carry that on to their patients, that the physicians who would use sunscreen were more likely to tell their patients to use sunscreen too, because they thought that was something that was important that they needed to address. And so I think it definitely probably was more of a personal issue rather than the patient's perception of it being something that they practiced. But I think it still has that good effect on if the physician believes that something's healthy, that they can pass that knowledge on to their patients and still influence their patients.
Let's talk a little bit about the implicit leadership theories. When you talked about it here in the presentation, you talked about implicit leadership theories, which was good. That's what we talk about in literature, is theories. In the paper, you wrote implicit leadership theory. Like it's so the idea is that everybody has theories of leadership, and so it's usually considered plural. It's just a little. The wording needs to be addressed just slightly. Okay. Right. So now we'll have these implicit leadership theories. There's commonalities within cultures, what we think a leader is, and there's of course differences across culture, and sometimes men and women have different theories from each other and other differences. Now you seem to be arguing that people have a moral, in this case physicians as leaders, have a moral obligation to fit people's implicit leadership theories. So we know people have these theories. We know, for example, these theories can be biased against groups of people. In America, they're biased pro-white against other ethnic and racial groups. They're biased pro-male against female. And we also know that sometimes when people think about a leader, this is kind of implicitly what I think about a leader, might not actually be what they want in a leader. For example, people tend to think more in terms of this agent and take charge person who's going to be decisive and blah, 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 and not so much about the caring aspect of a leader. But what we really want also from our leader, we also want them to kind of care about us. So essentially what our implicit leadership theories are not actually what maybe would be most effective, or what we actually are here to think more deeper, what we actually want out of a leader. That said, I'd just like to hear a little bit more of a discussion of why you would argue that physicians as leaders have an obligation to kind of to fit the societies that they're working in, their implicit leadership theory, in this case, implicit theory of physicians leader.
Well, I guess for me personally, I thought that it was one of those things that by fitting into these standards and these molds that society has, that they would be considered more credible and that the patients would have more confidence and therefore would practice the healthy behaviors and kind of it would actually affect the patient's health. And so there were studies that the non-obese patients thought that their physicians were more credible and were more likely to share their information, like their physical problems and things like that. And that, like, physician-patient relationship actually has a huge effect on their actual outcomes, because if the physician doesn't know what's going on with the patient and if they can't have this open discussion, then it's likely to impact their medical treatment and things like that. So, although it may not be what, like you were saying, like what people want or like what people should have, I thought of it more as like a way for physicians to gain credibility and confidence in their patients, to kind of build this trust in between their relationship that could ultimately better the patients. And since that's like their main duty and responsibility, that gave them kind of this obligation to fit into that mold, whatever it may be.
I have kind of a related question, just wondering if you came across this in there. So do you know if there's any research suggesting that the gender or the age of the physician has an impact on, so we know having an apple and so these healthy things that you looked at, but there's these other ideas of what we think of as a leader and race.
I didn't, no, but that would be interesting, yeah. Of like the male physician.
And then also, when it came down to sex, also the sex of the person who was being, especially particularly as you talk about role models, leaders have physicians as role models. And the role model literature, those factors play a role.
Yeah.
Similarity factors, age, race, and gender do play a role in who people choose to be role model. I think that's an argument in this paper that leaders are, physicians are role models.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important argument you make. Let me ask one last question.
Wait, can I just say one thing to kind of relate to that? There was one study that I thought was interesting. I didn't really mention it, but it was the one where they talk about the formal dress and the white coats and things like that. And it did show the effects on the age of the patient, where the younger patients were less likely to see the formal dress and the white coat as being something that was important as the older generation. So there was that generational factor in that.
Change in maybe their implicit theories of what really matters. The doctor doesn't have to have a certain dress on for the doctor to be.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I wanted to emphasize that it's not necessarily what, like cultural norms and those are sort of arbitrary, and so it's not necessarily what the physician has to wear, how they have to look, but as long as they fit that mold of what it is.
So are people, this kind of goes into that point, are people, doctors, obliged to appear healthy even if they're unhealthy? So for example, so we talk about the difference between perception and actuality and reality, I know that is in the beginning. So people's perceptions of what looks like a healthy body is actually oftentimes, you probably know this, sometimes on the skinnier side where it's actually unhealthy, and their eating behaviors and the restrictions are actually unhealthy for them, and particularly, and that's going to be influenced by the media, right, what we think is healthy, skinny, healthy. So let's just say that some people now we're creating a society where seeing somebody who's really skinny, where in actuality they're really unhealthy, being that skinny, but that looks healthy. That is the look of somebody who's, does engage in all these healthy behaviors. Are they then, would you go, based on a study, the entire would you say that physicians in that case are obliged to appear that way, even though that's going to make them personally?
Well, it's actually really interesting that you mentioned that, because at the beginning, and even last semester, I think when I presented this, and up until a few weeks ago, I had it entitled Appearance of Health rather than Healthy Behaviors. And so from that, after I was talking to Dr. Price about it, I didn't want to go so far as to say that they had an obligation to appear healthy, since that was such kind of something that wasn't really in their control as much, and so that they would only have an obligation to practice these healthy behaviors. And so I'm still kind of toying with that idea, that I think that there definitely is, you have to play on the perceptions of how your patients are viewing you and things like that. But I couldn't, for this, when I was actually defending it, bring myself to say that they actually have to appear that way, that it's the healthy behaviors that are more important, I guess. But it's really interesting to see.
I actually wanted to ask you about the assertion that physicians should be held to a higher standard than the general public as healthy lifestyles. And I think I followed pretty well what you were saying about the utilitarian basis for that and the beneficence factor, I guess. But looking at it from Kant's perspective, it seems like we would all sort of be liable to, what's categorical imperative, but what's the, if we applied that to any one of us, we would come with the same result here. Maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So outside of Mill, did you find other bases for suggesting that physicians be held to a higher standard?
I get, though, when I was looking at the virtue ethics and things like that, they talk about like habituation and things, and we need people and teachers to learn the right habits and the right way for virtues and things like that. So that's kind of another way that I saw physicians playing the role, because I mentioned in the paper that children that learn their healthy habits from their home and their parents are likely to practice the same healthy habits. And so if their parents aren't practicing the good health habits, that they may need a physician or someone else to show them that this is actually a healthy way to act instead. And then, yeah, I guess that's kind of it, because
I can help you a little bit. Part of this, we disagree about how Kant's interpreted here. You talked about contradictions in conception. They think that those kinds of contradictions apply to everyone, so we want the strict duty to do those things. But Kant sometimes talks as though other kinds of duties can vary from person to person, and the universalists among the Kantians don't like that. But Kant says even helping behavior, like how much you're required to help other people, can depend upon how much help you yourself need. So if you will that people help you a lot, then you can't very well will that everyone helps people only a little bit. You have to will that everyone helps everyone quite a bit, which means you yourself would have to help more. So you get, because it plays, there's some playroom or some discretion basically in how this works. And so you were trying to, Will argues, you're trying to say there is something special about the way physicians will, because they are in this position where they have to will that other people live healthy lives. Maybe some debate, the empirical statement. Maybe they don't really will that, but you're saying part of the profession is to will. Yeah, will that. Maybe you say they can't will, and they have to will that they're healthy, or they'd be out of job. Contradiction. That if they are willing in a way the rest of us don't, that people engage in healthy behaviors, then they themselves have to do it in a way that you and I could say, I don't care who the rest of the world eats cooked puffs and things like that. That's fine with me.
Just to follow up on that, you also brought up the virtues aspect of it. But I wanted to ask about Stuartism. It seems, you know, and I'm not an ethicist, of course, but you can sort of correct me if I'm off track with this. But my recollection of Kant is that if an action is to be moral, it has to be done without self-interest. Okay, you do it as a sense of duty. So if you had a physician who was maintaining a healthy lifestyle just because they wanted to get that pleasure out of it and wasn't doing it to emulate that for their patients, would that still be considered a moral action of Kant?
For my interpretation of things, it's more, it's not that you can't do something because you have an inclination for it. It's so that he recognizes that people have inclinations for certain things, and that if that goes like with your duty, then that's like fine, that's like better. But if it goes against your duty, then you have the duty to go against your inclination type of a thing. And so that's when you have the moral worth, is that when you want to practice these unhealthy behaviors, but you can't because you have a duty not to do them, but that's where the moral growth kind of comes from. And so, sorry, I guess I can forget your question.
That's where it ties in with the virtue ethics theory, I think, related to motive that someone has. So, I mean, would you consider a physician to be virtuous if they said, well, I realize the effect of my having this particular behavior is going to be positive on my patients, but I really don't want to do this. That they're really against the idea, but they'll do it. The employer wants them to, whatever. They still consider it virtuous.
Yeah. Maybe kind of like the situation thing. So like the situation is telling you, like we talked about, where you may like want to do something that's unhealthy, but you still have that duty to practice those virtues and to practice that duty. I guess.
I don't know. It's about that. Did you have a question?
I came in with a bunch of particular questions, because you and I talk about particular things every week, little arguments, but I decided I'm not going to answer those now. Because your presentation, you think about bigger issues. Let's assume you're right, and that physicians do have a moral obligation to either practice healthy behaviors or live a healthy lifestyle. And then the AMA gets your thesis, and they read it, and they say, she's right. We do have this added ethical obligation we didn't know about. Are you willing to go so far as to say that the physician who doesn't do these things is an immoral physician and an ethical physician, that being unhealthy, it moves into a different category, right? That now, with all these things of harming people, that's immoral, other kinds of behaviors, that now being unhealthy with your physician is unethical. And so would you go as far as to say, you're not doing your duty, you're not doing your moral obligation, you're unethical, and maybe even, subject to ethics policy at the AMA. So someone, disciplines you because, you smoke and you're in a position, or you're overweight, and we can tell it's because of your diet or whatever.
Yeah. I guess as you were saying that, I thought about what the AMA actually says is that you should have the health so that it doesn't impair your duties and ability and your responsibilities to the patient. And so I guess as you're saying that now, I'm leaning more that all of this kind of fits in with that if physicians can influence behavior based on their perceptions of the physician's own health and things like that, then you do have a responsibility to live up to these standards and live up to these perceptions of standards levels of health. And so that does kind of fit into where they were talking more about, I guess if you're too tired or too stressed, how it can physically affect your ability to affect the patient, but in a way it also affects your ability to affect the patient's outcome based on their perceptions of you, so kind of going the other way, if that makes sense. And so they're kind of correlated, I guess. That if the patient has a bad perception of the physician based on them not practicing these healthy behaviors, that it would still be unethical, which is kind of what I'm arguing, but also
You're extending their obligation. They would say you have an obligation. You can't be so tired that you can't practice. You can't be a drunk. You can't be whatever it is that's going to stop you from doing your job. And you're saying, and more than that, you need to be in the gym. You need to have a good diet. You need to do these other kinds of things. Like even patients could complain about you. And you can say, I've been seeing Katie for the last 10 years, and I just can't motivate myself to become healthier, in part because she's smoking cigarettes and she's not working out herself, and you're in a bad influence. It makes the obligation much stronger. It makes them say, we want to live with that and say, yeah, this is just the way it is. As a physician, you have this extra obligation that people don't have, and if you're obese and it's your fault or whatever else, then you're immoral, you're unethical. In our profession, you in fact say that you're unethical. You're not living up to our standards.
I would like to say that I would think that it would be immoral, but I don't know if I could go that far because I think it'd be hard to prove.
You just proved it.
But it can't, I mean, I guess that it would be hard on a specific basis whether you could say if it's someone, I think that it's extreme, but I think I would want to say it, but I can't. I don't know if I can actually get myself to say it.
You might say that you prove the general case, but the particular case.
Exactly, where you can't say that Susie is not her health is damaged because the physician is smoking and things like that. So this physician should be not practicing. Well, he or she may very well be qualified. I think it's a little more complicated than that.
To make the claim in a particular case, that person's behavior might have to approach the behavior of the person who's already seen as being in violation of APA requirements. I said APA. So there would be such an obvious case that they would almost be the person who's so unhealthy they can't do their job.
And why that argument is kind of more on the idea that physicians serve as role models. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. What evidence do you have that physicians do serve as role models for us? You talk about a bit in your paper, and you give one example of physicians serving as a role model. But do you have any other? What kind of evidence do you have to serve as role model? I mean, it makes sense they could, but do they actually?
Yeah, outside of what I talked about. Not really. I guess the biggest thing was that I saw that through counseling and through their power and authority and things like that, that they could influence that patient's own personal habits, is kind of like what I talked about. And so I guess I don't have any like actual statistical case studies, but that was more just implied in reference that they have this expert power and they have, they're wearing white coats, so they kind of have that authority power and things, and so that kind of just put them in that type of position that I guess they more just implied that rather than actually.
And so you do argue that they serve as a public benefactor, that argument well, but I might argue that it's not just physicians that serve as a public, but anybody who serves in counseling, following your arguments that you wrote here, that it would seem like, for example, teachers. When teachers are teaching little kids how to take care of their child, or how to not smoke, or whatever, or then they have people who are not doctors who come in and give, and so would give little lessons on how to engage in safe sex or whatever it happens to be, and they are not physicians per se. They're some kind of teacher or counselor, or so would you argue that the arguments that you're making would extend beyond physicians to them as well?
Yeah, I think I would. I thought too about like other people in the medical field as well, and while I was mostly focused on just physicians in general, because that's kind of the figurehead, I guess, of the power, but there's also nurses and social workers and like other people that are in the medical setting that still do have positions of influence on patients, and so I think that a lot of the same arguments do apply to them too, but I just didn't really address those.
Do you think the moral obligation to practice these healthy behaviors applies equally to all physicians, or just the ones who are involved in, say, the general practitioners or counseling patients, or what about the pathologist who never sees patients and just sits in a lab?
Yeah, that's probably a good point, that it's definitely the primary care physicians who are the ones that spend a lot more time counseling and motivating and influence their patients, because I guess when you get into more specialties, you're trying to fix specific problems, and you're not really addressing the overall health of the patient. So I guess you can make that argument, but at the same time, they still go through medical school and still have that same general knowledge, and they still have that same position of authority. So I think it's actually that it should be able to help.
So with this healthcare reform that we have in place now, it seems that the demands on those general practitioners are going to increase. They already have huge patient lists as it is. And you mentioned in your thesis some of the obstacles to the healthy behaviors for these doctors. One of them is the big time pressure. And so if you had a situation where you're comparing the moral status, say, of two different actions, one being where you have a physician who takes an hour out of their day and exercises, and another physician who says, no, I would use that hour to see more patients to have a bigger impact on the people who need care. Which of those two is more important?
Well, I guess it would sort of depend on the quality of the treatment too, because if the physician who is going to exercise isn't seeing as many patients, but they're better able to influence their patients and better able to communicate and influence their patients to practice these healthy behaviors, that while the other physician may be able to see like 5 more patients or something, that they might not be receiving the same quality treatment, kind of like what Mill's talking about, where there's a difference in like quantity versus quality, and that maybe you might just need more physicians or nurse practitioners who are also helping to take over those extra patients and those extra roles. And so, I think you kind of have to look into both of that.
I have one more. You want to speak first?
One last one. You never came back to Regina.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
I was hoping you would come back to her.
Yeah, sorry.
So you never came back to her. What are your thoughts? How would you end?
How would I end her? I think she's a very well qualified physician. She there's countless things. She was started her own practice in rural Louisiana and has been the head of boards and the first female, first black woman on a lot of these boards, and so she's definitely qualified to have this type of position. And I think that her weight isn't necessarily an issue if she were to address it as sort of a way to shape this perception, because if she actually is healthy, like we don't know what, but if she can help mold our perceptions for what actually is standards for health, that could be beneficial, or that if she were to talk about how her own issues and with weight and things like that, and that she could further be able to motivate patients and things, and if she would even change to show that it can happen, and that maybe people should start practicing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that she's immoral as Dr. Price would, why not? But that maybe she could use her position of authority to better shape our ideas of health and influence us to actually practice healthy behaviors. So I guess I don't, if that makes sense, I don't necessarily see an issue with her weight if she's able to address it appropriately.
My final question, I wanted to ask you about this process that you're about to enter, going through the application with medical school, and the admissions process there. And if we do go with the assumption that physicians who practice these healthy behaviors are more effective, and there's greater confidence that patients have for them, and maybe even greater compliance, do you think medical school admissions committees have a moral responsibility to select people from medical school who they know practice healthy behaviors, who aren't obese, who don't smoke?
I think you could definitely make that argument. From when I've been visiting the medical schools and things, I've noticed that they've really been shaping their curriculum to try and create a better, healthier environment for their students and future physicians. And so when I was looking at the bulletin boards, there were committees that were meeting in, like even classes that talked about like stress levels and things, and that they have gym memberships, and even how the schedule is based, where you have like your free afternoon to kind of focus on what makes you healthy and what is good for you so that you can get through all the stress of medical school and stuff. And so I can definitely see that they're realizing how the pressures of not only being a physician but a student can affect your own health. And so I think it can definitely go into something like, maybe it shouldn't be like a box that you check off, like race or like weight or something like that, but maybe like in the interview they can look into see how, I guess if you could give off the perception that what you are learning and what you like agree with and what you say that is important, like you actually follow through with and believe, if that makes sense.
So if I'm a medical school admissions interviewer, someone comes in to interview with me and I see a pack of cigarettes, in a purse where they smell like smoke, when they come in. Should that be, a big red flag for me that this is something probably don't want to send into the profession?
I mean, I don't think it should necessarily be something to completely like cross them out of the application for or anything, but I think it's definitely something to consider that if you're choosing physicians that are going to be motivating patients and trying to make physicians that can be good role models, that you're selecting people that kind of fit that criteria. And so, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all black and white, but I think it should definitely have some sort of impact.
Any questions from the audience? Good. I'm introducing myself first. I'm Nathan Carter. I'm a visiting scholar on sabbatical from Purdue University. I want to thank you for letting me come and sit in on this. It's been very interesting. I'm at a distinct disadvantage. I didn't read the paper, so the two things I mentioned may have been addressed. One is the analogy to lawyers, that's my training, who have to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Even if they haven't done anything wrong, that's not the standard. It's the appearance of impropriety. The possibility of that would really be interested in hearing your reaction to is on the question of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And does this have any correlation to the topic of mental health and those who treat people in the field of mental health?
Mm-hmm. Well, to answer your first question, I think it could definitely apply because everything that I was really talking about was patients' perceptions and things like that. And so, and your credibility and able to, I guess, fulfill like the duties of your profession and things like that, if that's affected by people's perception of you as a leader and such, that you do have an obligation to fulfill those. And for your second question, yeah, I think you could. That I know I see friends that deal with like stressful situations all the time, and they are in stressful relationships or things like that, and that's definitely not a physical aspect of your health, but those types of things can definitely, over time, relate to your physical health, where your body can be physically drained from going through all this type of exhaustion. And so I think that mental health is just another extension of your physical health, and so I could definitely see that applying, that without taking the necessary like preparations and precautions and things like that, that it could have negative consequences down the line too. So definitely, yeah.
Questions?
Okay, thank you, Katie. Thanks very much for coming. Okay, you'll step